No wire hangers. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm continuing my masculine and feminine energies film breakdown series with Mommie Dearest. If you're not familiar with what I mean by masculine and feminine energies, I have a ton of videos on this content, but a brief summary. Masculine and feminine energies are energies that live within all of us. We all contain both energies, but we all have a core energy. This is when we're most ourselves in. That energy often links up with our gender. It doesn't have to, but it very often does. We can be in wounded or healed versions of either of these energies. And each of these energies contains archetypes. We all contain all the archetypes within us that we can tap into whenever we need to. I have a lot of videos about the masculine and the feminine archetypes if you want to learn more. And in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need one partner to be in the masculine and one partner to be in the feminine. These opposite energies attract sexually and same energies repel sexually. So let's talk about Mommie Dearest. This film was requested. I had never seen it before, but since this is Mother's Day weekend, I thought why not break down one of the most iconic movies about mothers that is ironically really a horror story. Anyway, before I get into this breakdown, I have a few disclaimers. For one, this movie could potentially be very triggering. This breakdown may even be very triggering to you. I want you to honor yourself in your own journey. If you do have trauma or triggers or anything around abuse, specifically in childhood, narcissistic abuse or something like that, I just want to make sure that my content is always going to be beneficial and helpful for people. I don't want it to be harmful. So just keep in mind where you are in your journey. If you do have healing that you need to do around topics like childhood trauma or things like that, just please be mindful when watching this. And if at any point it is just not something that you can handle, please feel free to come back to it when and if you do feel like you're more comfortable talking about this in the future. I also want to give a big disclaimer that nothing I say in this video is ever intended to justify child abuse. That is something I'm absolutely 100% against and not endorsing in any way. I am going to dissect some of these characters and some of the motivations behind why it is likely that they're doing what they're doing, but it is never intended to justify child abuse or any kind of abusive behavior specifically towards children. So I just want to make that very clear. I do have to be honest, I was a little conflicted about doing a breakdown of this movie or a movie like this because I do feel like in our society it seems like we're really quick to blame mothers. We're really quick to put all of the responsibility and the blame on the mother in a household. And in this movie it's a little bit different because it is about a celebrity and it's somebody who went into motherhood through adoption knowing she was going to be a single mother. Like, it's a little bit different situation than what you see in the average household today. But I do want to make a note because, you know, this is Mother's Day weekend. We're going to talk a lot about mothers, specifically very toxic, unhealthy ones. And I've noticed in my discussions, and I have a few videos where I talk about things like narcissism and narcissistic abuse, things like that. I do notice that people jump so quickly to the mothers being narcissistic, the mothers being the problem, the mothers being abusive, and I'm not negating anybody's experience with that. That said, when I discuss things like narcissistic abuse or abuse from a father, people don't tend to jump into those conversations as quickly as they do to complain about a mother. And I want to break down a little bit of my understanding from my studies of narcissism. I'm not any kind of licensed therapist or PhD psychologist or anything like that. However, I've done a lot of research about the topics specifically surrounding narcissism. I want to make a few notes about the fact that we have a culture that jumps really quickly to calling mothers narcissistic or blaming narcissistic mothers on things. Now, there are mothers out there that are absolutely narcissistic. There are mothers out there who are absolutely abusive. It happens. It is not okay. But when we look at the stats of narcissists, overwhelmingly narcissists are male, which means that there are significantly more male narcissists than there are female narcissists. I love how when I bring that up, specifically men love to jump to, well, maybe the stats are wrong. But these are the same men that will also tout a lot of divorce and child support arguments and things like that that support their story. If we're gonna say that the stats are wrong, well, then we have to question all the stats. Is it possible that the criteria for how we judge a narcissist, how we diagnose a narcissist, how we calculate these statistics, is it possible that's off? Absolutely. Narcissism is actually a highly underdiagnosed, if you want to use the term diagnosed. Some people do, some people don't. It's something that is hard to pinpoint. And so I will acknowledge that maybe the way that they got these stats may not be accurate. I do also believe that there are more male narcissists than female narcissists because of a societal thing. It's not necessarily a gender thing specifically. It tends to be more of a societal thing, and the shifts in our society and the way our society is going, I would argue very likely is going to produce more female narcissists. I don't think it's going to diminish the number of male narcissists, but I do think it might increase the number of female narcissists. These are theories, they're hypotheses. However, I find it interesting how so many people jump to, even when I bring up like having a father as a narcissist, so many people jump to, well, my mother was a narcissist, my mother was a narcissist. And is it possible that your mother, or the people who are saying this, is it possible their mothers are narcissists? Yes, absolutely. I'm not trying to take away their experience. However, I do find it interesting how we talk so much about narcissistic mothers in our society, yet statistically speaking, you are vastly more likely to have a narcissistic father. There's a few theories behind why that is, and these are not just my theories, these are actually theories that people who study this exclusively have come up with. For one, a lot of narcissistic behavior, I know a lot of people aren't going to like to hear this, but a lot of narcissistic behavior and characteristics of a narcissist are qualities we much more accept in men than we accept in women. And if more men, or meaning fathers, are narcissistic, it's easier for people to just say, okay, well, my father is acting like everybody else's father, so we don't necessarily identify our fathers as being narcissistic as quickly as we would a mother. Whereas having a narcissistic mother is going to be less common, so that we are going to notice it more. And I think that this happens a lot with people, where we tend to take the exceptions, like the very dramatic exceptions, and make them into the rule. Because, I mean, our news media does it all the time. It sensationalizes stories that aren't very common and makes us think that they're common, and then ignores the things that are common because it's like, well, that happens all the time. So I think that's where we get the disconnect. We jump to calling mothers narcissistic. We don't identify fathers as narcissistic as much because some of the behaviors of a narcissistic father are much more socially acceptable. There is also the argument, which I don't totally disagree with, I think it has some valid points, that having a narcissistic mother may actually be more traumatizing on a child than having a narcissistic father. Simply being because, well, in our current society, there are a lot of fathers who aren't even there, or are, even if they are necessarily in the home, they're not really present in the home. So children have less or no contact with a father. So if he is narcissistic, the child may not even know because they don't know their father, and they're going to have a different view of their father because the father is not present, either not physically present or he just isn't involved in the child's life as much. However, the majority of the parenting in our current society falls to the mother. So the mother being more involved and more present in the child's life, a toxic mother is going to have a stronger effect on the child. It logically makes sense, right? It doesn't mean that more mothers are narcissistic. It simply means that when you have a narcissistic parent who is the active parent, it's probably going to have a more dramatic effect on the child, whereas a parent who isn't so present but may still be toxic isn't going to have as dramatic an effect on the child. Now, obviously, having a father who's either non-existent or is there but not an active parent is going to have its own effect on the child, because both the mother and the father affect the child. But if you do have a more toxic, narcissistic, abusive or something mother, because they're the active parent, they're probably going to have a stronger effect on the child, and the child's going to remember that parent more, whereas the parent that wasn't so much present, while their lack of presence may still have a deep effect on the child, it's not going to be as obvious to the child that that parent was unhealthy. It can also be easier for the child to fantasize about the parent that's less active and put them up on a pedestal because they don't actually see the parent every day, day to day, or they don't have the parent quite as active in their life. So the parent that may be present, all of their bad behaviors then become amplified, and the child can then put, it would be a survival skill really, can put the parent that isn't quite as active or isn't present at all up on sort of this pedestal, because they just have a fantasy idea in their head of what that parent is like, as opposed to the parent that's actually there present with them, all of their flaws, all of their behaviors, whether they be human behaviors or whether they be super toxic, are going to be heightened. The child's going to have a harder time denying the flaws in the parent that's present than they are in the parent that they either don't ever see or don't see as much. Now, there's also a factor that one of the key characteristics in something like narcissism is a lack of empathy. And as children, we tend to look for the empathy, the nurturing, the support, the comfort from a mother figure. So if the mother figure lacks that empathy, which is what we typically go to the mother for, it's probably going to have a deeper effect on the child than if the child, say, goes to a father who lacks empathy, because generally speaking, most children are not specifically going to the father for empathy. Now, having a father that lacks empathy or is narcissistic can have a hugely destructive effect on a child. It absolutely can. However, if you look at what children typically seek from both parents, if you kind of would like empathy from your father, and not getting it from a father may not seem like as big a deal, whereas turning to the mother and wanting empathy and not getting it may have a more severe effect on the child. I mean, I don't like to play the who has it worse kind of game, because at the end of the day, we're talking about childhood trauma and things like that. It's a matter of like, what was your experience? What do you feel like you need to heal from? That's the important thing. And it's taking the steps now that you're an adult to heal from these things. That's the important step. I'm just throwing out some of these ideas because I do feel like we jump so much in our society to blaming the mother because the mother is typically present. I also think, and I want to point this out, this isn't universal. This is something that I've learned over the years of, you know, having a somewhat complicated relationship with both of my parents, and things that I've learned from observation when I was younger, and a very complicated relationship with my mother. As I got older, as an adult, becoming a woman, going through a lot of my own life experiences, actually going through the experience now as an adult, something I don't talk about a whole lot on my channel, but I actually am caring for both of my parents who have had a lot of health problems over the past few years, and actually shifting into a little bit more of a parenting role, so to speak, with my parents, and seeing my parents' dynamic from an adult perspective. Not everybody's going to have this experience, but this was definitely my personal experience, and I think many other people may have the same experience too. I started to realize how much of the way my mother was showing up and the things that I would blame her for were her reflection on how my father was showing up. That can be a really eye-opening experience, and I think very often, especially in young girls, you want to put your father up on a pedestal. And I think as children, oftentimes we want to put our fathers up on a pedestal to a certain extent because we want to believe in this very strong, healthy, masculine leadership. So we oftentimes, this is actually a psychological phenomenon, where we oftentimes have a really hard time accepting flaws in either parent, but specifically a father figure. What very often can happen, this isn't universal. I'm not saying that, you know, some of you out there might be like, no, I just have a toxic mother. My mother's a narcissist. I honor that. I would also invite you to look at the overall scheme of your family, specifically if your parents were together, or even if your parents were not together, but they still were co-parenting together. Very often as women, and I've talked about this in other videos, as women are more adaptable generally, and they tend to be much more responsive. Very often behaviors that women express are a reflection of how a man is showing up. It can also be trauma that a woman, a mother, grandmother has experienced from men in their past. And like I said before, none of this is to justify any kind of child abuse or any kind of, you know, ways that parents traumatize their children. But I also think it's important to not constantly jump to blaming a parent that may be expressing their anger, frustration at the world, and ignoring the other parents. I actually had some conversations with some people in a community about narcissistic situations, in my observation that growing up, oftentimes you see the parent that is being abused by the narcissist as being the narcissist, because the narcissistic parent will paint the other parent as the bad guy. Sometimes as adults, when you grow up and you see things from an adult perspective, you start to realize that it was actually the parent that was acting like the victim, was actually the one that was causing the other parent to be more volatile. As adults, we're responsible for our own actions. However, in very abusive situations, and if you do have one parent that is abusive to the other parent, and then maybe it turns on the children or something like that, parents can often use the children as a way to manipulate each other. These are all very toxic behaviors. I'm just inviting you to not jump to conclusions, not get so caught up in your own pain and trauma and how you view a situation in one way and cloud yourself to the possibility that the things that you have seen are maybe not exactly how you see them. I don't even know if that made any sense, what I just said right now. A big side effect of narcissistic abuse is, you know, things like gaslighting, and people can very easily be brainwashed into seeing things a certain way, specifically as children, because children so much rely on their parents for survival. You oftentimes as children, you can perceive things in a certain way because that's the way you need to perceive the world in order to believe that you're going to survive it. And as an adult, sometimes it can shift your view of things. It happened to me, so I'm not necessarily saying that if you believe, say you have a narcissistic mother, I'm not saying that you have to just, you know, forgive her and you have to move on and you have to have her in your life or anything like that. Like, none of that. It's not for me to say. It's not for me to decide. I invite you to do the healing work that you need to do to be the best version of yourself, but not be so closed-minded and narrow-focused to the realities around you that you never actually like open your eyes and see things in a different way. I also want to be mindful that one of the main reasons why in so much of the research that I've done about narcissism, they don't tend to focus on why narcissists become narcissists. And I think one of the reasons is because very often when people are victims of narcissistic abuse, they can tend to have a heightened sense of empathy. It's usually one of the reasons why people end up getting into narcissistic relationships, is because they have a heightened sense of empathy, and narcissists can feed on that. So I think one of the reasons why many people who discuss narcissism to help narcissistic abuse survivors is they don't want the survivors to get too caught up in the why a narcissist does what they do, or like the backstory or the reasons behind it, because oftentimes it kicks in that empathy and it makes the narcissistic abuse survivor, it oftentimes causes them to not do what they need to do to heal or separate themselves from the narcissist. I don't want this video to ever be about that. This is not about having to have a narcissist in your life. This is not about, you know, you don't even have to forgive the narcissist if you're not ready to. Like, I think forgiveness of people is important for yourself. It's challenging. Forgiveness is not a virtue that I am very good at, I will admit. However, you can forgive someone and choose to not have them in your life. You can forgive someone and understand things, but also accept the fact that what they've done or how they are is not okay. There's a lot of nuance to this. So when I talk about some of the stuff in this movie, I don't want anybody to think that I'm justifying behavior or to see what I'm talking about or the roots of what I'm talking about as being a justification and being like, oh, okay, well, I should forgive this person, or I should have this person in my life, or I don't want this to cloud anybody's healing process. I'm just going to talk about the way that this particular, you could very well call her a narcissistic mother, is presented in this movie. Now that I've gone on that spiel, let's dive into the movie. The movie Mommie Dearest is actually based on an autobiography written by the famous actress Joan Crawford's adopted daughter. Joan Crawford is played by Faye Dunaway, and there's a little bit of controversy as to whether or not this movie was actually accurate to the book, if the book was written accurately. I mean, there's kind of controversy around this whole storyline. I'm going to focus primarily on the way that these characters were presented in the movie. Whether it's accurate, whether it's not, who knows. I did do a little bit of research on a little bit of the story separate from the movie, but only little bits and pieces, so just to fill in some of the gaps. I'm primarily going to talk about the movie. Now, in this movie, Joan Crawford is Hollywood royalty. She is absolutely an iconic Hollywood actress. And right away, you see her life, and the way she is presented in the beginning of the movie is very, very symbolic. Now, it's interesting how a lot of people, when I was trying to find clips for this movie, were referring to her morning routine and the routine that she goes through as being very vain. Now, I'm not going to say that Joan Crawford isn't vain. She's a Hollywood actress. You're probably not going to find anybody in Hollywood that doesn't have some level of vanity. However, when I first saw the opening scenes of her obsessive beauty routines and her obsessive schedule and cleaning process and everything, it did not read vain to me. It read obsessive compulsive disorder. Like, it read this obsessive need for cleanliness. You very often find that in very wounded masculine behavior. When you have a woman who ends up in very wounded masculine energy, she tends to get obsessed with perfectionism, obsessed with structure, obsessed with cleanliness, obsessed with detail. Like, that is very characteristic of a wounded masculine female. And as you find out more about Joan and a little bit about her backstory in her life, it becomes more and more evident how much wounding she actually has. Now, it's interesting how she decides at one point that she wants to have a child. It does seem like she wants to have a child in her life because there's something missing. There's something missing in her life. She says she's had a few marriages. She's had quite a few miscarriages. Now, maybe that's true. In Hollywood, miscarriages can also be code for somebody got pregnant and it was going to affect a major Hollywood picture or going to affect someone's career, so the miscarriage would just happen. That does happen in Hollywood. Probably still happens today. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know if, you know, what was accurate. However, very often when you get a woman who is very severely wounded in her energies in general, but especially when you have a woman who has completely rejected her feminine energy completely, it does feel a lot like Joan has. A lot of gynecological problems can happen. Now, some of the reason why she couldn't get pregnant could be complications from either actual miscarriages or Hollywood miscarriages. Different time period, we don't know. But oftentimes, when you have an energetic wound in your feminine energy, you will very often have gynecological problems with reproduction, things like that. It's very common. She decides she wants to have a baby. She's got this part of her, like, I really do believe she is feminine at her core, but she's so blocked and she is so wounded. She has this desire to have kids, but she doesn't really understand what that entails. I don't believe, at least the way it was portrayed in this movie, that she ever wanted kids just for the publicity, that she wanted kids just for the attention. It doesn't appear like they're presenting it that way. It does appear like she genuinely wanted a child. However, you find out a little bit about her childhood. At one point, Greg, he's a Hollywood lawyer who she's involved with at the time. They're not married, but she's involved with him. They seem to be very much in love at the beginning of the movie. You know, he makes a comment about a child needing a father, and she was like, well, you know, I didn't have a father and I'm fine. So she obviously doesn't have a father, and she makes a comment about her mother couldn't keep a man. So she kind of had this revolving door of men coming in and out. When that happens, chances are you tend to have childhood trauma, specifically in that time period, right? It's also interesting how when she's talking about her mother, she talks about her sloppiness. Seems to me, at least the way they portray it in the movie, like Joan associates her mother's sloppiness with not being able to keep a man. So in this particular case, it kind of explains why Joan has had this obsessive need for cleanliness. Now, we don't really know what she means by sloppiness. Her mother might have actually been a sloppy person. However, our current society tends to deem things as like cleanliness, cleaning, those kind of things as being feminine. In reality, feminine energy is very messy. It's very chaotic. Now, does that mean that you live in filth when you're in the feminine? No, it doesn't mean that. However, cleanliness, order, simplicity, structure, those kind of things tend to be a more masculine quality. A lot of the obsessive, like, housewives that were obsessed with cleanliness and neatness and order were very much in their masculine. They were. The feminine tends to live in more chaos, in more creativity, in more flow, and things don't necessarily have to all be lined up perfectly. However, the fact that Joan saw her mother as being sloppy, and she may have actually been sloppy, we don't know, but the fact that she associated her mother with that, she also associated that with her mother not being able to keep a man. You see, Joan has now associated cleanliness as being what would make her desirable. She makes reference a few times to children who are adopted are chosen, they're wanted. Kind of implies that Joan is desperately seeking to be chosen, to be wanted. At the root of it, she now feels like this obsessive need for cleanliness and order is going to make someone want her and choose her. How many women can relate to that, right? Like, how perfect can you make everything? How perfect can things be? And then I'll be chosen, then I'll be good enough, then people will want me, right? There's that obsessive need for that. She does have a lot of obsessive tendencies with her appearance, which, you know, some people can call it vanity. I'm not denying that that's probably the case. However, in Hollywood, when your entire demeanor, your entire life is solely reliant on how you look, you could see where that would lead to an obsessive tendency. Her look, her image, her physical appearance is her livelihood. It's how she survives. That with her cleanliness, and I also think too, several times in the movie, Joan associates being a little messy with being like slutty or a tramp. That comes up a few times with Christina, and I'll get to that in a minute. But there's almost this association with like her mother being sloppy but having all these men as being trampy, and like Joan needs to feel superior to that, and she needs to feel better than that because she needs to feel like she escaped her mother. And I did know, I read a little bit, you know, there's the famous wire hanger scene, and I'll get to the abuse and things like that here, but there's the famous wire hanger scene, and I couldn't figure out, even after watching the movie, like what the issue was with the wire hangers. And I looked it up, and apparently Joan grew up where her mother worked in a dry cleaner. Joan associated wire hangers with living in poverty. My guess is, and none of what I'm about to say right now is justifying any of Joan's behavior, however, it does appear like Joan is carrying a huge amount of childhood trauma. That's where I get a little bit leery of really calling Joan a narcissist. Does she exhibit all the narcissistic tendencies? Yes, she absolutely does. Very easily make an argument that she is a narcissist. She's not a psychopath. I've seen people refer to her as a psychopath when I was doing some research trying to find film clips for this. I don't believe she's a psychopath. For one thing, psychopaths are born, they're not made. So the fact that so many of the things that she does are triggered by past traumas lead me to believe that she probably was not born this way. I don't see her as a sociopath so much, even though there's a lot of behavior that she exhibits that is absolutely inexcusable. However, sociopaths tend to have a bit more of a disconnect from reality and more of a disassociation with feelings and emotions, whereas Joan is very much led by her feelings and emotions, which I believe is a sign that at her core she's a feminine being. She's just so blocked off and ashamed of that. You could make the argument very well that Joan is a narcissist. It's a valid argument. I would say though that the fact that, at least the way it's presented in the beginning of the movie, is, you know, she has a lot of these obsessive compulsive disorders, she's got a lot of wounding and traumas, but she doesn't necessarily seem like she is cruel to the people around her. It starts when she starts adopting children. That's not exactly how narcissism works. It does appear, at least the way they present it in the story, that Joan seems to be moving along at a relatively normal pace of having a lot of neuroses and obsessive compulsive disorders. She's very wounded in her masculine, she's rejecting her feminine, all this kind of stuff. It's when she has children that she kind of loses her mind and goes crazy. Now, Joan decides to adopt a child. She adopts Christina, and then she ends up adopting Christopher, her son, and those are the only children they talk about in the movie. I believe Joan Crawford in real life actually adopted 2 more kids, but they're not in the movie. Even early on in childhood, when they're little, it does seem like Joan is going along with the publicity she's getting, you know, from having the children, but she almost doesn't seem comfortable with it. Like, she wants the kids to have a more normal life, but she kind of feels like she's a slave to, you know, having the publicity photos and things like that. She signed on to a contract, and contracts with studios and things like that were very different for stars back then. You could argue that Joan may not have had as much say in what the publicity was and things like that back in those days as some of the celebrities might have now. However, it is interesting when she's in the process of getting the child, and of course Greg, her boyfriend and lawyer, makes the comment that she's gonna have to have a father, and back in those days, if you were a single woman, adopting a child was very uncommon. And she thinks she can do it on her own. She doesn't need a father because she didn't have one. Well, now you could very much argue that the fact that she did not have a healthy father figure in her life is part of the reason why she ended up the way that she did. And you could also make the argument that because she did not have a father figure, for one, if her mother was just going through men, she may not have even known her actual father. They don't really say that, but it's kind of implied. That abandonment wound from her father could lead her to a lot of mistrust of men. Very often when a woman has a deep mistrust of men, that's when she enacts her own masculine energy. It's really what Joan does. She really is in her masculine energy because she doesn't really have a man. I think she mentioned she's been through 2 husbands. I don't think she marries Greg, but she ends up with another husband. I don't know how many husbands she actually had. They don't really go into that kind of detail in the movie, but she does have another husband a little bit later on in the movie. But you know, she kind of can't seem to keep a man. She's obviously desperate to try to be accepted, but the reality is when you're that much in your masculine as a woman, you're either going to attract a man who isn't going to be a healthy, stable partner because he's probably going to be more in his wounded feminine because she's so in her wounded masculine, or she's going to repel a man who is more grounded and stable. You get the impression that Greg is very grounded and stable, and they have moments together where they do kind of connect. But generally speaking, they end up just butting heads because they're 2 masculine beings, you know, and Joan really can't push Greg around, and she's used to getting her way. She needs to have control. She can soften sometimes when Greg gives in to her, but when Greg doesn't give in to her, she can't handle it. They butt heads and they can't really make it work. So then of course Greg leaves. Well, Greg is Uncle Greg. He's the father figure that these kids have known. So now the kids don't have a solid father figure. But now when Joan was working up to adopting these kids, she got rejected by the first agency she went through, and they told her she wasn't a desirable candidate. And it was interesting how she went through this whole thing about how you were depriving some child of the privileged life that I could give them, essentially, which is true. Absolutely true. She has all of the, you know, luxuries in the world. She's all the money and access to everything in the world she could possibly need. Although you could argue all the money in the world is not going to make up for the fact that she has so much wounding and she doesn't have, you know, a male role model for the children. So having enough money to give a child a stable lifestyle is something. I mean, it's not nothing for sure. If a child's in poverty, it's better than that. However, she didn't really have a healthy, stable home life. But it's interesting how she uses that argument, but then later on in the movie, she actually is essentially not letting the children enjoy her wealth and enjoy their lives with her. She's kind of depriving them of having that privileged childhood. So we'll get to that in a minute. This story is really told more from the perspective of Christina, the oldest daughter. Christopher, who's the second child that's adopted, the son, you don't really get too much of him. It is interesting how it's not really talked about too much in the movie, but that Christopher is actually like strapped to his bed. Again, some of the stuff might be triggering for some of you. I tried looking up what the reason was behind that, and I couldn't really get a solid answer. I did have some people say that, I don't know if this was true in his case, but that those straps for the beds were actually for people, specifically children, who sleepwalked. And I do, not personally, but I do know of someone who has a very severe sleepwalking tendency and actually does have to be strapped down, because when they do sleepwalk, they actually, in some cases, have harmed themselves, have actually done things that, you know, potentially were life-threatening. I do know that that's, I guess, primarily the reason those exist. There was conflicting reports as to why it was that he was strapped down. Some people believe it was because he had a sleepwalking tendency. Some people believe it was because she just didn't want him getting up in the middle of the night. I don't know. But you don't really see much about Christopher in the course of this movie. It's mostly about Christina and Joan and their relationship with each other. Christina, of course, being the first child that was adopted, she was a little girl, and Joan really does have a big shift when Christina starts to become a little bit older. And it coincides with a lot of things that are going on in Joan's life. Joan goes through a big breakup with a man that she obviously deeply cares for and who was there for her when she adopted her kids and was a father figure to her kids. Losing a relationship like that can be very traumatic. She also ended up getting fired from her studio and essentially being told that she's box office poison and that she is washed up. Like, she's losing her whole career. She's losing her whole, like, purpose in life. It's really interesting how when she gets fired from the studio, she keeps herself very composed. Like, she's composed, she's put together. She comes home, she loses her mind. It's an interesting scene. She's out in her garden and she's just like hacking away at the flowers, and she's just like, you know, crying and screaming and everything like that. That's an interesting point that I want to point out. Her doing that, totally normal. Okay, this is a person who has just gone through a lot of really dramatic tragedies in her life. She's had to keep her composure, keep her calm, keep her cool. Eventually, all those emotions, if she doesn't find an outlet to express them, are going to bubble up and come out in really bad ways. Having an outlet to express that anger, particularly as a mother, is important. What she did wrong in this situation was she had her, essentially, housekeeper wake up the kids and get her kids involved and have her kids clean up the mess and have her kids participate in this. And the kids are absolutely terrified. They're being, you know, ripped from their beds late at night to have to clean up the mess that their mother is making and see their mother like chop down a tree and whatever, and the kids are traumatized. Now look, as a parent, you can't shield your kid from everything, right? Kids are gonna pick up on things. Kids pick up on more than we even know. However, releasing that anger, releasing that frustration is important because you don't wanna hold that inside of you. You want to, as a parent, not involve your kids in that as much as possible. Can you completely shelter your kids from all your emotions or all your frustrations or all your anger? No, of course. And it is important for your kids to know that they can express that as well. However, children don't have the capacity typically to understand what that is and what's going on, and also to disconnect that, okay, their mother, their safety, their security, their parent, that's all they have, is going crazy right now. That fear and terror is now gonna live in them. And the fact that she's basically telling these kids, okay, you have to clean up my mess, because she, again, she's in that conflict, right? She's got to release her emotions, which is very feminine, but she's ashamed of all of her feminine, right? She associates feminine with being messy and being wrong. She needs to clean it all up. So it needs to clean up quickly. You need to clean everything up quickly. Again, she needs to let go of that anger and frustration, but she can't have it look messy, and she can't have it be messy. Having an outlet to release your anger, I mean, it might be gardening, it might be chopping down some bushes or chopping down some trees or something like that, or whatever. It might be, you know, going to like a boxing gym or something and getting out your anger. It might be going to therapy. It might be, you know, whatever it is, whatever it is you need to do to release your emotions. It's important because you don't want them to come out as triggers later on where you actually end up hitting your kids, which unfortunately she does in the movie. However, your kids shouldn't be a part of that, because that's you releasing your anger, but kids don't necessarily have the capacity to fully understand what's going on, so for them it just reads as terror and fear. That, I think, was a significant scene there, because her needing to release those emotions, totally normal. She's ashamed of that within herself, which is part of the problem, but also the fact that she involves her kids in this, because I don't think she really fully understands the trauma that she's now pushing on her kids, which again, you could argue is narcissism, because you're not really thinking about other people's feelings, you're only thinking of your own. However, when you're in that trauma, that trigger, that wounding, that, you know, release of emotions, you might not be thinking. If this was the only thing she did wrong in the whole movie, it wouldn't be as big a deal. It's not the only thing she does wrong in the movie, right? So there's also really a line there where she has a daughter who's coming of age at a time when Joan's youth and her physical appearance is, I mean, it's not that it's starting to fade, she's still beautiful, but it's not as marketable in the business that she's in. So she's starting to age out of her livelihood, her career, her life. And that's one of the things that I see with a lot of these young girls that put so much of their bodies, their sexuality, their everything like out there in the world. It's like if you start really limiting yourself to your value, your only value being in your youth, beauty, sexuality, the world is not going to value you as more. And then when you lose those things, because those things all fade or shift, or, you know, as women we go through different seasons, if you, that's the only thing that you cultivate and that's the only thing you believe is your value in the world, if those things fade or those things shift and things like that, like, it's going to be really traumatic for you. Whereas if you actually, I mean, cultivating those things, having youth, beauty, sexuality, all those things, none of these are wrong, but that's not all that there is of you. But Joan has put so much of her life into that, so now she's in the process of seeing her daughter come into her own. It's an interesting thing, you know, I'm not a parent, but this is something that I've heard from many people in the spiritual healing world and people who are parents and things like that, is when you have kids, it's gonna bring up all your childhood stuff. So what's happening really is Joan had kids. She wanted to have kids. In reality, she had kids because she was missing something in her life that she didn't know how to seek. I don't really think it was just for attention and publicity, although I do know she gets accused of that later on in the movie, but I don't really believe that that's what it was, at least not the way it was presented. But she was missing something in her life. It may have even been that she wanted to relive her childhood through having a child, living it better because she was ashamed of her childhood. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was she ended up bringing up all of her childhood trauma by taking care of a child. That's very common. That's not something you put on the child. And that was the problem, is Joan put all that stuff on the children. Having a child and having that bring up childhood trauma, normal. As an adult, it's your responsibility to heal that, work through it, and not project that onto the child. That's what Joan does wrong in this, right? And that's really what we perceive as being the narcissism. Is she a narcissist? You could very well make the argument she is. But that's what's actually going on here, is she now sees her daughter coming into her own, stepping into her own. Joan is now fearing her life disappearing, all of her hopes and dreams disappearing. It's bringing up childhood trauma for her, and she shifts from like wanting to give her children everything, although there's this thing where when the children get gifts, they're only allowed to keep one and they have to donate all the rest of them. There is something to the idea of teaching your kid to not hoard everything for themselves. However, the idea of being able to like only keep one of your birthday presents and having to give away all the rest of them when you have a mother who could probably just like donate money or donate toys to a charity. Or I could see even saying like, okay, donating your old toys that you've played with and now that you've grown out of, like donating them to kids who are younger. Like, I mean, there's definitely ways that you can go about that, but there is a sense that Joan always kind of feels like, as much as she wanted to give these children a privileged life, once she has the kids, she's like, we don't want to spoil them. I gotta tell ya, I mean, I didn't grow up in like a Hollywood lifestyle by any means, or it wasn't even a wealthy household, but I did grow up as an only child in a very like upper middle class life. And I mean, my parents would literally say like, we don't want her to be a spoiled brat, as if being a spoiled brat was like the worst possible thing that I could be. Like, well, she can be a serial killer as long as she's not a spoiled brat, right? I know firsthand how that obsession with like not wanting to spoil your kids and actually going the opposite way and trying to deprive them can actually really screw up a kid, because it trains them to believe that they're not worthy of stuff. They see their mother living this glamorous, over-the-top lifestyle, but then the kids are not allowed to participate in that. It really does program them to think, okay, well, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of this. The financial abuse, for sure, is a theme throughout. Again, the idea that Joan almost like wants to deprive the kids so they're not spoiled. That's partly where the wire hanger thing comes from. Like I mentioned, that had more to do with Joan's childhood trauma, but she associated wire hangers with poverty. And when she sees in Christina's closet a wire hanger and a nice dress and a wire hanger, she flips out. Now, when I was watching that, I thought to myself, how would a little girl get a wire hanger? Like, it's not like this little girl went out and bought a wire hanger and hung her clothes on it. Like, why would the wire hangers be in the house if they weren't allowed to use them? Maybe it just came back in from the dry cleaner or something and the little girl just didn't change the hanger. I don't know. I don't really know what it was. I know that's like such an iconic line from this movie, but it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. But her association was wire hangers are for like cheap clothes, and she buys her daughter nice clothes. How dare she treat them like they're cheap clothes, and ends up beating her with a wire hanger. It's a very uncomfortable scene. But again, there's that financial abuse. So then there's also like Christina goes off to boarding school. There's a whole storyline around that, which, you know, we'll get into. But at one point, Joan tells Christina that she's gonna have to go on like this work study program because they don't have any money. They're broke. They don't have any money because, you know, Joan's not working as much and all this kind of stuff. But then Christina ends up finding all kinds of boxes and things that her mother's been ordering and her mother's been buying. And she's like, well, she told me we were broke. And even later on, when Christina goes to her mother is just married like one of the heads of Pepsi Cola, very wealthy man. And Christina basically, you know, is on her own. She's, you know, a struggling actor and asks her mother if she can borrow a little bit of money to get by. And her mother's basically like, no. So it's basically like Christina's stepfather that steps in and is like, let me give you a little bit of money to get you by and stuff. Again, it's this constant idea of you're not worthy of me spending money on you. You're not worthy. And I understand to a certain extent wanting to teach your kids about the value of money. However, lying to your kids about money, telling your kids that you're broke when you're actually overspending, and you're actually being really bad with money, not treating your kids. And again, even if it's not actually true, the association the child now has. My mother says we're broke, yet she's spending a ton of money on herself and things she doesn't need, but I'm not as valuable to her as what she's spending, right? Like, that's going to send a message to the child that they're not worthy of being cared for, right? Financial abuse, it's something that we don't talk about in our society nearly enough. It's a real thing. Very often comes with things like narcissism, and also comes with things like addictions and things like that. Financial abuse is a lot more common than people think, and I could probably do a whole video just about that, but that was a thread that I noticed throughout this movie. There's also the idea that a thread of not wanting Christina to be a tramp. Joan is basically shaming her into expressing any level of sexuality. Like, for one, she catches Christina kind of like playing with, you know, Joan's makeup and kind of pretending that she's accepting an award, and really she's like kind of honoring her mother. She's kind of like playing her mother. She says she was kind of just playing as her mother, and kids play, they have fun, they do those kind of things. Joan interprets that as her daughter making fun of her, and then tries to, like, you know, actually cuts off all her hair because she's put hair gel in it. And it's basically like, I'd rather you go to school bald than have you look like a tramp or this or that or whatever. Like, it's this whole like fear of her being a tramp. So then Christina kind of has some like gets caught making out with a boy at her boarding school. The school wants to give them a simple punishment because they didn't think it was that big a deal, and Joan basically like pulls her out of school, sends her off to a convent, and it's basically like, you know, I'm not gonna have you grow to be a tramp, like that kind of thing. And then even too, when they're at dinner together, when Christina's home from school, Christina was literally just being nice to the waiter, and the waiter was being nice to her, and it was just a friendly conversation. But Joan basically is like, you know, don't flirt. Like, when you flirt, it gets misinterpreted. Like, it wasn't really flirting what she was doing. Like, she wasn't being slutty, but it's this constant shame. And I think some of that has to do with Joan's feeling that she's becoming less sexually desirable. It may also have to do with an association with her mother, with Joan's mother, possibly being sloppiness and stuff back in a certain time period was kind of associated with like a trampy, promiscuous woman kind of thing. So it's hard to know if that's what she meant when she called her mother sloppy, but Joan's got this idea in her head, like, she's like, I'm not gonna be like my mother, so she's trying to make sure that her daughter is not like that either. There's also the obsessive cleanliness. Joan has obsessive cleanliness that she was so focused on doing before she had kids, but then when she had kids, it was like she was putting that obsessive cleanliness on her. She was making Christina like scrub the bathroom floors, and if it wasn't good enough, she would force her to stay up and scrub the floors again. There's an aspect to people that have an obsessive compulsive need for cleanliness, perfection, things like that. Motherhood can bring up a lot of stuff. If you're a severely wounded feminine woman because you're rejecting your feminine and because you're in this obsessive need for like masculine structure and perfection, motherhood can be really traumatizing for you, because when you're dealing with kids are messy. Kids are free flowing, and kids express themselves, and kids are not perfect. It's even like, you notice the first time that Joan holds Christina, it's like, oh, you're perfect, you're perfect. Kids aren't perfect. Nobody's perfect. Nothing is perfect. Joan has this obsessive need for perfection. It makes being a mother really impossible, because she's pushing that perfection onto the kids. And kids really don't thrive in that obsessive need for perfection. You see it in the pool scene where Joan is basically having Christina swim laps, do dives, things like that. And even this is back when Greg is still in the picture, and Greg's like, you need to give her a break. She's wearing Christina out because she's pushing that competitiveness. Competition is very masculine. When you have a woman who's very competitive, and Joan's always like, even Joan, when they're swimming laps and stuff, and Joan's like, I'm gonna beat you every time, I'm gonna beat you every time because I'm always gonna be better than you. Joan's got that competitiveness in her, and she's pushing that competitiveness onto Christina. Because for Joan, she's in that masculine competition. She always wants to compete. So she's pushing that onto her daughter because that's how she perceives that people should be. Again, it's rejection from the feminine, which the feminine is free flowing. It's not like, hey, let's just swim in the pool and enjoy the water and enjoy the flow. It's like, no, this has to be a competition. This has to be something that you work to achieve. The kids aren't really allowed to play and enjoy themselves, which actually might be one of the reasons why Christina got into acting in the first place, because she wanted to, as an adult, she wanted to play. There's a few moments. There's the moment when Joan flips out on her because she's playing like dress up with Joan's makeup, but there's also the moment where Joan yells at Christina, and then Christina is in her room and she's yelling at like her 2 dolls like her mother is. In reality, that's Christina's way of dealing with that. Like, it's that playtime that is so important for kids. I actually went to this lecture in college actually about children and playtime and the importance of play and imagination and creativity and stuff. That was really fascinating. Kids need that playtime. They need that imagination time. That's how they learn to work through things and stuff. And that's really what Christina was doing. Joan saw it as mocking her. So Joan actually basically like took the baby dolls and hid them, and Christina was like, where are my baby dolls? And she's like, well, they left. I guess they won't be bad anymore. And in doing that, she was basically telling Christina, hey, I'll get rid of you if you don't do things the way I want you to do them. Would Joan actually do that? I mean, she did send her off to boarding school, but like, would she actually get rid of her? Who knows? But at the end of the day, she certainly was putting the idea in Christina's head that Christina could be let go of. Which is interesting because Joan was so big on making sure that the kids knew that because they were adopted, they were wanted, like somebody chose them. But then she also turns around and treats the kids as if they're replaceable. Again, teaching the kids that the kids are not wanted. So probably one of the most dramatic and disturbing scenes is actually when Joan takes Christina out of boarding school because she was caught making out with the boy. They come back. There's basically like a journalist from Red Book that's there that's doing like a documentary. A big theme in this is Joan is very concerned with how she's perceived to the outside world and cares more about what the outside world thinks than what's actually going on in the home. So she needs to present herself as the perfect mother with the perfect kids and is more concerned with the way things look than what's actually going on in the home. That's a very, very big aspect of narcissism. Needing to be perceived some way by outside people, but not caring so much about how things actually are in the home. It's all about the facade. It's all about how things are seen. And the two of them have this battle where Christina's basically like, I don't care. I'm going at you. I'm just gonna say what I have to say. Like, why did you adopt me? And this and that was just for publicity and blah, blah, blah. And they end up getting in this argument. Joan says something really interesting. It's a really poignant scene where she's basically like, you know, why won't you treat me as well as like any stranger off the street? And Christina says, because I'm not your fan. And they actually go at each other, and Joan almost actually chokes Christina to death, and they have to be broken apart. It's a very uncomfortable scene. It's a difficult scene to watch. But it is significant in the fact that the narcissist, if you have a narcissistic parent, say for example, often narcissists need to be perceived as being better than everybody else. That's easier to do when people don't know them. If you are a celebrity, you're seen as this kind of like, you know, greater than the average person thing, whether it be because of your beauty, your fame, celebrity money, whatever. It's easy to fool people into thinking that you are superior, better than everybody else. However, in your intimate relationships, in your one-on-one dynamics, whether it be actually, you know, a parent-child dynamic, or whether it be a family member, whether it be a, you know, a spouse, a loved one, you know, a close friendship, something like that. People in those relationships need more from each other than the average person on the street. And a narcissist, because they usually have serious blocks with intimacy because they don't want to let people get too close. Because when people get too close, you see the flaws, right? When you see somebody up close, you see the flaws. It's like a full-on Monet, you know what I mean? Like, from far away it looks great, but up close it's a big old mess, right? Like the line from Clueless. With narcissists, if people get too close to you, you see each other's flaws. Now, in an actual, like, healthy relationship, it's being able to let people see your flaws, let people see your imperfections, and let people love you anyway. Accept your flaws, accept the other person's flaws. Like, that's what creates actual, like, intimacy in a relationship. That's what creates a bond in a relationship. The problem is with a narcissist, you can't have that because the narcissist can't accept their own flaws, and they certainly can't accept flaws in other people. So you can't ever actually have an intimate relationship with them, because the basis of an intimate relationship, which is getting close and being able to love and accept each other for all parts of them, is not possible. And this is so significant in this scene because what Joan wants is for her daughter to see her like she is this, you know, larger than life Hollywood celebrity. But her daughter doesn't need her to be a celebrity. Her daughter needs her to be a mother. Her daughter needs her to have that connection. The daughter needs to accept that the mother's not perfect and see the mother's not perfect. And the mother needs to see that the daughter isn't perfect but love her anyway. That unconditional love is so important in that type of relationship. That's how people know that they can be loved and accepted. Now, if you don't have that unconditional love from a parent in a relationship, you can give that love to yourself. It's probably going to be a little harder, and you're probably going to need to work through wounds and traumas from your past. Most of us have been there, so you're certainly not alone if that's your situation. However, that's usually the biggest issue when you have a narcissistic parent, is that you can't ever have that unconditional love with a narcissist. What you need, especially in a parent-child relationship, particularly with a mother, is you're looking for that unconditional love. You're looking for somebody to say, I love you anyway. It's like that saying, like a face only a mother could love. It's because the mother's gonna love you regardless. And when you have a narcissistic mother, that tends to be a big blockage, because a narcissist can't fully love someone because they can't fully love themselves. And that scene where Joan is like, I want you to treat me like you're one of my adoring fans, and Christina's like, yeah, but I'm not your fan, I'm your daughter. That's really significant. I mean, I think that's the moment that really puts the nail in the coffin, that we were dealing with a narcissistic mother. Not to say that all the other behaviors are not absolutely indicative of being a narcissist. However, you can see all of those other things and the direct correlation with what the trauma is. Whereas in that situation, the facade and only caring about the idea of what it looks like and not actually caring about the surface, that really is at its core a big aspect of narcissism. Some of the other behaviors that Joan has exhibited in this, you can see where it's just she's really mishandling her own childhood trauma, not excusing it, but you can tell that that's kind of where that comes from. Even the financial abuse you can see in people who are addicts, and Joan is obviously a drinker. She's obviously got some addiction problems, obsessive compulsive kind of disorders and things like that. And you can see what living from that wounded masculine energy really did to Joan. I mean, it really destroyed her. I mean, she ended up, they don't say how she died in the movie, but they do. I looked it up. She died of a heart attack, which, and I'm just going to throw this out there because I don't think this is universal. And nowadays you're seeing a rampant uptick in heart conditions. Not going to get into why, because that's a whole other video. When we talk about heart conditions and heart attacks, it's interesting how even in Sex and the City, when Mr. Big had his like heart surgery and stuff, they talked about his heart blockage, and of course he ended up having a heart attack and all this kind of stuff. Often with people with narcissistic tendencies, I mean, it's not universal. I'm not saying everybody that has a heart condition is a narcissist. However, there are correlations between people having blockages in their heart chakra, lacking empathy, lacking compassion, and also having issues with heart and things like that. I think there's symbolism in the fact that some people who just do not have a heart, empathy, love, compassion, they can't have that true connection with somebody, and having blockages in their heart. I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not saying that's universal, but I do think that you could make a correlation between energetic blockages in the heart chakra and like physical blockages in the heart. Just gonna throw it out there. Yeah, there's a lot of other aspects to this movie we could probably dive into, but in reality, this movie really is a symbolism of a wounded masculine mother. I would say, you know, pretty obviously a narcissist. We can get really caught up in like saying this is a narcissist, that's a narcissist, this is narcissistic behavior, this isn't, this and that, blah, 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 and there's a lot of nuance to the whole conversation. The important thing is, if you have experienced a relationship in any form, whether it be family, romantic, anything, with a narcissist, the important thing is that you heal from that. So whatever you need to do to heal from that, you know, if you need to label it, if you need to identify it, if knowing why people did what they did helps you, if not knowing why people did what they did helps you, that's really the important thing. Like I said earlier, this movie was tough to watch, so, you know, please be mindful of that. After you watch this video, I do recommend that you watch the movie. See if you can pick up on some of the things I mentioned, but you know, if you don't feel like you're ready for that at this point, I honor that. I will try to put up some individual clips, not the more violent scenes, I'm sure, because I'm sure social media will take those down because I get flagged for things that are way milder than things that happened in this movie. But I'll try to put up a few little shorts to kind of break down some of the individual scenes in this movie. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. If you have any thoughts on anything I mentioned in this video or any other topic requests or anything like that, let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you and I love your suggestions. If you're a woman who'd like to connect to her feminine energy, I have online courses courses. Details in the description box below, along with links to all my social media accounts. If you are a mother or have a mother or somehow connected to Mother's Day, I hope you have a wonderful Mother's Day weekend. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.